Hello, everyone. My name is Paige McKenna, and this is Disease Dissected, the show where I tell you all about disease. We're going to cover the causes, treatments, biochemistry, and historical significance of ailments both well known and super niche. On today's episode, which is the first episode, I want to go over some general classifications of disease, the difference between a disease and a disorder, give you a little bit of a history lesson on one of the most important medical discoveries ever, and share with you something in medicine that I think is super cool. So, to get us into it, to get started, I want to tell you about the difference between a disease and a disorder. They're kind of like interchangeable terms, but actually they're not the same thing. The distinction is pretty simple. A disorder is a group of symptoms that disrupt normal body function, and a disease has an identifiable cause. So, there are two big general classifications of diseases that I want to tell you about today. Those are infectious diseases and deficiency diseases. And then I also want to tell you about two types of disorders, those being genetic disorders and physiological disorders. So, to start it off with infectious diseases, these are the ones that you probably think about when you hear disease. The ones that pop into your head that are like the boogeyman, like the scary red cell with spikes coming out of it, that are here to make you sick and miserable, and it's awful, and they look like the pictures of germs that they show you in elementary school. So, infectious diseases are caused by organisms that include bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites. Common ones include the common cold, the flu, COVID-19. Those three are all viral infections. Strep throat is a bacterial infection. Things like ringworm and athlete's foot are fungal infections, and malaria is a parasitic infection. So the treatments for these, I lovingly refer to them as the anti-whatevers because they're all anti-something, right? So the most common one that you're going to hear about is antibiotics, very famous. We love our antibiotics. You use those to treat bacterial infections. Some of the common ones that you hear about that you probably know are amoxicillin, and that's used to treat pneumonia and bronchitis. And the big one, the one that we found first, keep an eye out for that a little bit later in the episode, is penicillin, and we use that for strep throat and UTIs. For viral infections, we treat them with, you guessed it, antivirals. These are medicines that block receptors so that viruses can't bind to and enter healthy cells in your body. They also help boost your immune system. Most of them don't have like the name recognition that antibiotics do, like amoxicillin and penicillin, but one example is oseltamivir, which is used to treat the flu. Moving on to antifungals, which treat fungal infections. These ones, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, are so interesting to me because the thing about fungus is that evolutionarily, genetically, humans and fungus are a lot more closely related than you realize. And so it's been really difficult to develop medicines that will treat fungal infections because anything that you make that is antifungal is basically anti-human. So it's like a really fine line to walk, and you have to be so careful because if you put something into somebody's body that is trying to kill off these funguses, you might accidentally kill off their cells instead, and that would be bad. So anyways, that aside, we have managed to come up with some antifungals. One that is commonly used for athlete's foot is called terbinafine. Finally, in the infectious diseases world, there's antiparasitics, which, as you might have guessed, are used to treat parasitic infections. These ones kill the parasitic organisms that live in the host. Malaria is kind of like the most common, I would say, disease that you hear about that is a parasitic infection. And for this one, they use a drug called artemether-lumefantrine. And that one is used because it's fast acting. It gets in and it kills the parasites really, really quickly. So moving on to the next classification of disease, we have deficiency diseases, which are pretty much exactly what they sound like. This definition comes from the National Library of Medicine. A deficiency disease is a condition produced by dietary or metabolic deficiencies. The term includes all diseases caused by an insufficient supply of essential nutrients like proteins, vitamins, minerals. It also includes inadequacies of calories. So an example of this that you might have heard of is scurvy, which is like the pirate disease. It's like you see pictures and it's like, oh, their teeth are falling out, and that's because they haven't had enough vitamin C. So they have a vitamin C deficiency called scurvy. Another common one is iron deficiency. As far as treatments for deficiency diseases go, it is pretty cut and dry. You just replace the nutrient that's missing. You can either take an oral supplement, you can eat foods that are rich in those vitamins and minerals that you're not having, or you can get an injection for it. It's pretty cut and dry. Stepping away from disease a little bit to talk about a couple kinds of disorders, there's two that I want to hit. The first one is genetic disorders. This definition is from the Cleveland Clinic. A genetic disorder occurs when a mutation affects your genes or when you have the wrong amount of genetic material. So, common examples that you might have heard of are Down syndrome, which is caused when a person is born with an extra chromosome 21. Other common ones that you hear about are cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia. So these are diseases that you don't contract them, you pretty much are just born with them. And so for treatment, you can't really cure a genetic disease because the disease is you and you can't really cure you. So genetic diseases, they're not really treated as you would treat an infectious disease. There's not an antibiotic that can cure cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. You can treat it, but you can't cure it. So there's things you can do to help alleviate some of the symptoms, but you can't fix it, quote unquote. The last classification of disorder that I want to talk about today is physiological disorders. Physiological disorders are ones that are caused by the malfunctioning of one of the body's organs. So think things like diabetes and asthma and glaucoma. Diabetes, the pancreas isn't making enough insulin. Asthma, your lungs aren't doing what they're supposed to. Also under the umbrella of physiological disorders is mental health issues, because the brain is an organ that you have, and when you have a mental health disorder, your brain is quote-unquote malfunctioning. There's something that's going on that's not quote-unquote normal, typical. So treatments for these obviously depend on the disorder in question. You don't treat mental health the same way you treat diabetes, obviously. For diabetes, you manage your blood sugar, and for mental health, we know that there are certain medications that you can take, and you can also receive therapy to help treat the symptoms. So to kind of recap this first segment of the episode, there are 4 general types of diseases that I'm going to be talking about on this show, diseases and disorders, that are infectious diseases that are caused by organisms, deficiency diseases that are caused by a deficiency in something that your body needs, genetic disorders which occur when a mutation occurs or you have the wrong amount of genetic material, and physiological disorders which occur because one of the organs in your body is malfunctioning. Okay, now, so to give you a little primer on what a regular episode is going to look like with the historical content, I want to give a little bit of history about one of the most important medical discoveries basically ever. So picture this with me. Pretend it's the 1920s. You have gotten some kind of wound, working in the factory, your arm almost gets cut off. So you're waiting to go to the doctor, and there is not that much that they can do to prevent an infection for you. They can stitch you up, and they kind of then sit there and hope for the best because there's not any medications to make sure that you don't get an infection in your wound. All of that changed in 1928. There was this guy, his name was Alexander Fleming, and he was a professor of bacteriology at the St. Mary's Hospital in London. Fleming was returning to his lab after being on a vacation in September of 1928, and he was going through his petri dishes that he had in the lab. He had some samples of Staphylococcus in there, which is a bacteria that can cause boils and sores and abscesses. And he was looking over his petri dishes, and he noticed that something was weird on one of them. Usually these petri dishes were dotted with colonies, so if you've never worked in a lab before, basically you put a bunch of nasty stuff that has germs on it on this, it's called an agar plate, and then you leave it alone and it lets bacteria grow. So you can see what's going on there and you know exactly what you have. So he noticed something really weird on one of these dishes. It was dotted with the colonies like usual, except there was one little space where there was mold growing. And the area right around the mold, which later we will come to know as the zone of inhibition, there was nothing. Nothing was growing around this mold. And so what we later come to discover is that what was in this mold was a rare strain called Penicillin notatum. And this was what is going to become the first antibiotic. So Fleming, he dubs this stuff mold juice, this mold juice that he noticed was killing the bacteria. He calls up his colleagues, whose names were Stuart Craddock and Frederick Riley, and they start trying to isolate the penicillin from the mold, which is like a super tedious process, especially in the 1930s when there's not a sophisticated technology. And it began this really long, really tedious process of figuring out how to get the penicillin out of this mold juice. During like World War II times, they were trying to work on this, and so in like 1939, these scientists, and they started employing, they would call them penicillin girls, they would pay them like £2 a week to get this mold and start growing it in like bedpans and food tins, and just like grow this mold so they could have more of it, so they could try to find the penicillin to isolate it. And so it wasn't until 1940, remember it was first discovered in 1928. So in 1940, they carry out an experiment that show that this penicillin can protect mice from streptococci. And so the next year, in 1941, penicillin was administered to a 43-year-old policeman, and he had a crazy amount of recovery, but then they ran out of the drugs, and he unfortunately passed away. But it was then proven, like, oh, penicillin will fight off these bacterial infections. This has the potential to save lives. So I don't know if I mentioned this, but most of this was going on in Great Britain, and this was largely going on right before the start of World War II. And so as World War II starts happening, production of penicillin starts happening in the United States. Companies that we still know today called Pfizer start working on more efficient ways to produce this penicillin, and they still haven't quite figured out how to isolate it yet, and so they're working on it. In March of 1944, Pfizer opened the first commercial plant for large-scale penicillin production, and that was in New York. And so they're able to start manufacturing it on a much larger scale, which in turn went around to help the war effort for the Allies. And because of penicillin production in the United States, it was able to be shipped over to France on D-Day in Normandy to treat the severe casualties in British and American troops that ended up saving so many lives. So that's the tea on penicillin, which is largely and widely considered to be one of the most influential and substantial discoveries in medical history, alongside like the discovery of vaccinations and the discovery of anesthesia and how to properly do organ transplant. So to close out the show today, I want to do a little segment called What's Up in Medicine? So I just want to tell you about something in medicine, some kind of medicine that I just think is really cool. And so today I want to talk about something that just blows my mind every time I read about it. I've read about it at like really different stages in my life, and it keeps coming back and it keeps being so impressive to me. And it's the use of psychedelics for treating PTSD. So I have an article here from the US Department of Veteran Affairs talking about the uses of, bear with me, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, more commonly referred to, and as will be referred to for the rest of this episode, MDMA, and the use of it to treat PTSD. And it's crazy because the way that it works, to my understanding, is that you will administer these psychedelics, the MDMA, to the patient, and then you will do like therapy with them, and it helps rewire the neural pathways in their brain and changes it and helps them work through their PTSD, which obviously is not a perfect process, but I just think it is so fascinating, and it seems like such a promising way to help work through this thing that has really seemed like an insurmountable problem that needs fixing. And with that, we are at the end of our very first episode of Disease Dissected. I hope you learned something. I hope you're ready to tune in for the very first episode, which will be about a disease, and I haven't quite decided which one yet. If you're a student, I hope you're out there killing finals, and if you are not a student, then I hope you have a happy holidays.